Good afternoon, Global Santa Fe. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Sean McQueen. I'm the new president and CEO. I want to take a minute before we get started to thank our county commissioner, Anna Hansen, right here. Thank you so much for joining us. And a big thanks today to Kristen Killian, also please stand, who recommended and helped us secure today's speaker. And of course, her husband, Ambassador David Killian, who's on the board of Global Santa Fe, and Deborah Lilliart, who's these two, wave your hands in there. There we go. I'm excited to be here with all of you today, and especially excited to see so many of our Global Santa Fe fellows here today to join us to hear Devi Lockwood share her experiences of traveling around the world, collecting the 1001 stories on climate change. We're super excited to have our fellows here today and that they were able to get out of class. Some were able to come from Los Alamos, so it's really nice to see those young people here today to help you support Devi's speech today or talk. And with that, I just want to turn it over to our board member, Jim Falk, the man, the myth, the legend, to introduce Devi Lockwood. And thank you so much. He's our program chair and also a board member. Thank you so much, Jim.
Hello, everybody. And isn't it great to have a real president again instead of that interim? Yay! And I do want, before I introduce Devi, I want to also recognize Daniel Barron. Daniel, you are in the audience in the back. Remarkable gentleman who is nurturing, get this, 2,000 sequoia seedlings that he's planting in the region. Apparently, and you all who are native Santa Feans know this better than I do, but this was a native plant that was then almost extinct, unfortunately, because of deforestation. So we're very grateful. And also, Diana MacArthur in the audience, always a pleasure. Be ready for some tough questions, I tell you. And then, as Sean is building out the staff, I also want all of you to know, no longer send me emails when you say something's wrong with your membership. There she is, right back there, the one and only Molly Corbin. So, no longer are those emails forwarded to me. So now it is a great pleasure to introduce Devi Lockwood, who came to us just a few days after running the Boston Marathon. She hiked up Picacho, so she is strong as you can imagine, and it's really a pleasure to have her here. Do you know, I'm going to read a quote. 2022 saw record-breaking heat across America, Asia, and Europe. Catastrophic flooding in Pakistan affected some 33 million people. A series of tropical storms battered countries in Southeast Africa. All these extreme weather events, which impacted millions of people and cost billions of dollars, were worsened to some degree by climate change. And further warming is now inevitable, meaning that even more lives and money will be lost in years to come. This paragraph was in last week's Economist, and it's certainly alarming. But without the face or the name of individuals impacted, I think you might agree with me that it's very easy to skim over a warning such as this. Devi knew this, and out of her deep empathy and understanding grew her remarkable journey, which led to 1001 Voices on Climate Change, visiting some 20 countries by bicycle, cargo ship, truck, and yeah, even once or twice she had to get on an airplane, but with great reluctance. Through all of the individuals she meets, we learn to listen and hear about their fears and concerns about our changing environment. She's a native of Vermont, going back some 7 generations, a climate activist and an accomplished journalist. She graduated from Harvard with a degree in folklore and mythology, and 1001 Voices is her first book, but there are hints that another one is on the way. Her articles have appeared widely in many media, New York Times, Washington Post, Guardian, and today she's the commentary and ideas editor at the Philadelphia Inquirer, where she was previously an editor at the New York Times opinion section. Now, before she comes up, I just want to mention one other thing, and that is that her travel was first funded by a grant from Harvard University, Harvard College, for purposeful travel. Many of you have supported the gala at Global Santa Fe, where we raise money for our fellows. And thanks to the support of those who have contributed to Global Santa Fe, Debbie, we've given travel stipends to students to go to Germany, Morocco, and elsewhere. And grants like that and your support opens doors, such as the one that Debbie walked through. Devi Lockwood, come on up.
Oh my goodness. Well, thank you all so much for being here. It's a complete honor, and I've wanted to come to New Mexico for some time, so just such a joy to be here with you all today. I'm going to start kind of at one beginning. So 10 years ago, in 2013, I was living in Boston during the marathon bombing. And that was when bombs exploded at the finish line and several people died, many more were injured. The entire city was put on lockdown, and you can imagine that was a pretty scary experience. But when that lifted, I realized all that I wanted to do was just go outside and to walk and breathe and hear the sounds of other people. I found that I needed to connect and remind myself that not everybody is murderous. So in a fit of inspiration, I found a big cardboard box that had been previously used for a bunch of broccoli, and I wrote "Open Call for Stories" in Sharpie on it. And I wore that cardboard sign around my neck. And people stared at me. It's kind of a weird thing to do, right? But a bunch approached me, and they said, "Open Call for Stories? What does that mean?" I asked, "Do you have a story to share, and would it be okay if I made an audio recording?" And even though I was kind of just making things up as I went, I found that people told me all kinds of things, really personal things, and things that were so grounded in the places that we call home. And once I started listening to strangers in this way, I didn't want to stop. So I started bringing that cardboard sign with me everywhere. You can go to the next one. Yeah. So that summer, I rode my bicycle for 800 miles down the Mississippi River. I started in Memphis, Tennessee, and I ended in Venice, Louisiana, which is south of New Orleans, where the river meets the Gulf of Mexico. I brought the sign with me. As Jim mentioned, my undergraduate major was in folklore and mythology, and so I really wanted to listen to any kind of stories that people had to share with me. And what I found was that the farther down the river I rode my bike, the more stories I heard specifically about water and climate change in terms of things like intensifying storms, saltwater encroachment on the land, and people making the really difficult decision to leave places they had called home for generations, in some cases in the aftermath of a really big storm. I met one woman named Franny Canetti south of New Orleans, and I stopped in front of her office to check the air in my tires. She saw me there and invited me inside to share lunch. And in between bites, she told me about Hurricane Isaac the year before, in 2012, which had washed away her home and her entire neighborhood. A lot of people left, but she and her husband moved back to the plot of land that they called home in a mobile home just a few months after the storm. I couldn't imagine living anywhere else, she told me. Do you think there will come a time when people can't live here anymore, I asked. I think so, she said. Not in my lifetime, but you'll probably see it. You can go to the next slide. So to imagine the road I had been biking on underwater was just chilling. 20 miles ahead, I could see where the ocean lapped over the road at high tide, and there was an orange sign that warned that water would come up. Locals jokingly refer to the endpoint of Louisiana State Highway 23 as the end of the world. And so I wondered, what would it mean to put these voices, stories from people like Franny, in dialogue with stories from other parts of the world? My goal became to listen to stories of water and climate change, to wear that goofy cardboard sign wherever I could, and to amplify the voices of people who are the most impacted. You can go to the next one. And so over the course of 5 years, I was able to document 1,001 stories of people who are living with the impacts of climate change in 20 countries on every inhabited continent. Go to the next one. I also set out to address another problem. The language that we use to discuss climate change is often abstract and really inaccessible. We hear about things like feet of sea level rise, degrees of temperature change, or parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But what does this really mean for people's everyday lives? So one of the first stops on my journey was Tuvalu. This is a coral atoll nation in the South Pacific that is on track to become uninhabitable due to both food and water insecurity in my lifetime. The country is 585 miles south of the equator and home to around 10,000 people. And the highest point is only 13 feet above sea level. This is what it looks like approaching from the sky, and that line in the middle is the airplane runway. So there's a big siren that goes off when the airplane's about to land. It happens a couple times a week, but the rest of the time it's like a soccer pitch and people playing out there. So as you can imagine, this is a super vulnerable place to even really small changes in sea levels. And the thing that I learned from people while I was there is that there used to be a freshwater lens under the island, such that people could dig a shallow well and have water for drinking, bathing, everything, right? But in the last 20 years or so, that water has become both salty and contaminated from sea level rise. And people first noticed that something was wrong because taro and pulaka crops, which are these starchy staples of Tuvaluan cuisine, were rotting. So a lot has changed in Tuvalu in the last couple decades. Thatched roofs and freshwater wells are a thing of the past, and those wells are repurposed as trash heaps. And all the water for washing, cooking, and drinking now comes from the rain, and rain is so precious. Each home has a water tank that's attached to a roof by a gutter. And when it rains, I saw people just sprinting out of the house to make sure that every drop was going exactly where it was needed. And during periods of drought in Tuvalu, families, and women especially, have to make tough decisions about how to allocate that limited water. I met a woman named Angelina. She's at far right there. She's a mother of 3 who's my age. She told me that during a recent drought, her middle daughter was only a few months old. She, her husband, and oldest daughter could swim in the sea to wash themselves. But what about her baby? The newborn skin was just too delicate. If she went into the salt water, the baby would just get this horrible rash. And so how can a mother decide between having water to drink and water to bathe her child? These are just some of the questions that climate change is forcing people to deal with right now. The stories I heard about water and climate in Tuvalu also had a really sharp division across generational lines. Tuvaluans my age, like Angelina, don't see their future on the islands and are applying for visas to live in New Zealand. Older Tuvaluans I met told me that they see climate change as an act of God, and they couldn't imagine living anywhere else, much like Franny. And they didn't want to leave the bones of their ancestors, which traditionally are buried right in the front yard of those homes. My time in Tuvalu showed me how climate change can exacerbate both food and water insecurity, and that insecurity can drive migration. This theme was echoed in other places. Next one. In Thailand, I met a modern dancer named Soon, who had moved to Bangkok, from the rural north. Soon relocated to the city in part to practice his art, but also to take refuge from unpredictable rain patterns. Farming in Thailand is governed by the monsoon season, a shift in the direction of prevailing winds that dump rain, fill river basins, and irrigate crops from roughly May to September, or at least they used to. When we spoke in late May 2016, it was bone dry in Thailand. The seasonal rains were delayed, and water levels in the country's biggest dams had plummeted to less than 10% of their capacity. It was the worst drought in 2 decades. Soon told me that right now there's just no rain, and the balance of the weather is changing. He leaned back in his chair, expressing the dryness and imbalance like a fulcrum scale. That's the problem. The people who used to be farmers have to come to Bangkok because they need money and they want to work, but there's no more work in farming because of the weather. So migration to the city, in other words, is hastened by the rain. I also heard stories about climate-driven food and water insecurity in the Arctic. You can go ahead, actually, to the next one. So Igloolik Nunavut is a community about 1,400 miles south of the North Pole, home to 1,700 people. It's a really difficult place to get to. There are tiny planes that go to Nunavut from Ottawa, Canada, a few times a week. And when I visited in the summer, the sun never set, just circumambulates in the sky. That's how far north we were. I met a woman named Murray Airut, who's 71 years old, and she lives by the water. We spoke in her living room over cups of black tea. She told me that her husband had died recently, but when he was alive, they went hunting together in every season. It was their main source of food. I'm not going to tell you what I don't know. I'm going to tell you only the things I have seen, she told me. In the 1970s and 80s, the seal holes would open in late June, an ideal time for hunting baby seals. But now, when she tries to go out hunting at the same time of year, the seal holes are just too big and the ice is really thin. She told me that the ice is just melting too fast. A few years ago, Marie went seal hunting by boat and brought the animal onto the land to eat with her family, but the skin looked really old and was just easy to break. She blames this on increasingly warming water temperatures. Caribou hunting has also changed. In the 1970s and 80s, she went hunting for caribou on Baffin Island in August, where it was hot for her and there were lots of mosquitoes. But now there weren't any mosquitoes that she saw, and the sea is just getting warmer, which has a knock-on effect on other species that these people rely on for their source of sustenance. And of course, when the water is warmer, the animals change their movement as well. Igloolik has been known for walrus hunting, but in recent years, hunters have trouble reaching the walruses because you would have to use so many gallons of gas in the boat just to get out to the ice where they're living. So there were several things I learned on this trip, but one of them is that the reality of climate change is just all too often experienced in that acute lack of food or water, or an overabundance of water that threatens entire ecosystems and livelihoods. And of course, when we have insecure food and water supplies, it threatens the very basis of those places that we're able to call home. You can go to the next one. No, actually back. Yeah, great. Climate change, I learned, is also an environmental justice issue. That means that typically the people who are most impacted by the problem are also those who have contributed to it the least. And any solutions that don't prioritize the voices of people living with the impacts of climate change now, many of whom are women, people of color, those living in the global south, would just perpetuate the inequality that brought us to this point of climate crisis in the first place. And so it might sound strange to think of listening as a climate solution, but I really believe that there's something there. Storytelling can be a powerful intervention into climate silence and an invitation to use this ancient human technology of connecting through language and narrative to counteract inaction. It's also a way to get those voices into powerful rooms. So I want to read you guys a really brief excerpt from the introduction, if that's okay, specifically about listening, because I think it's kind of the philosophy that underpinned everything I was trying to do. Deep listening. Throughout the journey, I developed a method of deep listening. This was hard-earned and not at all instinctual. When I listened to early clips of my journey down the Mississippi, I cringed. I was too pushy. I spoke over storytellers, eager to insert myself. I listened only halfway, the other half of my mind on how I might respond or redirect the conversation. I'm an auditory person. When I meet someone, the first thing I notice is the musicality of their voice, how they let the taste of a word linger on their tongue or send sentences flying into the ether. Breath, intonation, word choice. Sometimes my favorite thing to do is just close my eyes and listen. In Margaret Wheatley's 2001 article, Listening is Healing, written a few days after 9/11, she wrote, "Great healing is available when we listen to each other. No matter what we have experienced in life, if we can tell our story to someone who listens, we find it easier to deal with our circumstances. Listening is such a simple act," she continued. "It requires us to be present, and that takes practice, but we don't have to do anything else. We don't have to advise or coach or sound wise. We just have to be willing to sit there and listen. And if we can do that, we create moments in which real healing is available." So when I'm listening, microphone in hand, nodding along and not breaking eye contact, there have been so many times when people have said, thank you for listening, or "It feels so good to share this story with you because I've never shared it with anyone else before." In listening, I want to be sure that people feel respected and heard. I met a Belgian woman in the UK who told me about how her hometown's water supply was contaminated from a plant that put a waterproof treatment on fabric. A man from Afghanistan lost his brother because of water contamination. An American woman who visited the Florida Keys as a teenager, only to return years later and find that the reef was dead, bleached. Thank you for listening, each of these people told me. I enjoy listening also to people whose perspectives and takes on the world are different from my own. There's a difference between offering stories and opinion and offering something aggressive or vitriolic. The first comes from the desire to share and connect. The second is purely an attack. One carries the potential for change and exchange, the other does not. Deep listening has to start from the basic premise that we are all equal, all worthy of being listened to, all human, that everyone has a story to share, that those stories matter, and that we can learn from each other if only we are fully present. Deep listening is listening without the intention to respond, listening with the whole of one's body, making eye contact, leaning forward, nodding along without interrupting. Deep listening is honoring, is bearing witness, is keeping one's ears and mind open without distraction or ego or fear. This kind of listening is urgently needed in the climate crisis because listening is the first stop on the way to solution building. If we're building solutions that don't take into account the voices of people who will be impacted, it's dangerous and, more importantly, ineffective. So if I were to have a few kind of key takeaways for you for my story, especially for the younger folks in the audience, it would be this. In a crisis, we have to get creative. We know that climate change is one of the biggest challenges of our time, and yeah, that can feel kind of scary. But it's also an opportunity to get a little bit outside of our comfort zone, to learn as much as we can, and to be a part of building solutions with other people. And sometimes we have to learn to listen to ourselves before we can learn how to listen to other people. The second thing I would encourage everyone to do is follow your passion. It's okay if you don't know entirely what you're doing when you get started on a big project, but as long as you wake up each day really excited to do the work that you've set out for yourself, then you're on the right track. And I think it's important that we all give ourselves permission to play, and the rest will just fall into place. The third thing I would want to say is that sometimes hope and solutions can be found in the most unexpected places. I found that through listening to strangers and riding my bicycle and wearing a cardboard sign, but your path doesn't have to look like that. And I really believe that hope is just paying close attention to our surroundings and learning to lean into the big questions, even when we might not know the answers. You can go forward to the next one. I also wanted to take this moment to reflect a little bit on the first Earth Day in 1970 and how far we've come and also how much work there still is to do. So in the 1960s, environmental destruction was really upfront, personal, and in your face. Los Angeles was shrouded in smog, a contaminated river in Cleveland caught fire, 3 million gallons of oil spilled off the coast of Santa Barbara, and bald eagles were teetering near extinction because of the ravages of DDT. People were noticing these problems, and they were starting to get excited about talking about them. And so Gaylord Nelson, a senator from Wisconsin, proposed these campus teach-ins on the environment. And on April 22nd, 1970, 20 million people took to the streets, and some 10 million school children participated in teach-in programs about the cost of environmental inaction. People were really fired up. And that turnout catapulted environmental issues onto the political agenda for the next decade and resulted in some really powerful legislation that we still have to this day. And I think today the story is a little bit different, right? We've known about the negative impacts of burning fossil fuels for a long time, and we live with those consequences of inaction in terms of extreme heat and floods and storms and fires and drought and displacement and the stories of people I mentioned a little bit earlier. And so I guess one question I would leave with you guys is, what would it take for the environmental movement to reach the level of passion lit by Earth Day in 1970? I think there's just so much more work to do, and you all are really well positioned to continue those conversations in your own communities. So thank you so much for having me, and I wanted to open it up to questions, too. We have a traveling mic.
So are you optimistic or pessimistic after your 1001 stories?
Definitely optimistic. I mean, it's hard. It's a hard-earned hope. But when I think about that question, I think about the people I met who were not letting despair weigh them down, and instead just taking really concrete actions in their communities. And one person I often think of is a woman named Tanea Tangaroa. She is a Maori woman living in a community called Wanganui in New Zealand, and she spent over 20 years restoring a wetland that had been used as a dump for decades, and doing really unglamorous work, hauling out tires and planting native seeds and watching as slowly wildlife began to return to this place that was formerly really toxic. And what she's done in addition to that is started to teach kids in our community, elementary school kids, bringing them out there, talking about this wetland, teaching them the names of those plants and animals. And it's such a small thing that's such a big thing, right? But hope for me is a verb and is so grounded in that kind of action. And so, yeah, that's what kept me doing it, really, was hearing stories from people like her.
I understand that you traveled the stands.
A few, yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about what were the most dramatic changes that you saw there and how they were affecting the locals?
Yeah, I mean, there was one doctor I met in Kazakhstan who was talking about the knock-on effects of centralized planning for water and agriculture having just completely dried out Lake Balkhash, and whole communities were forced to relocate. And he met the person who had been in charge of, carrying out that plan, who was just riddled with guilt for seeing the way that this landscape was devastated. I think that was one of the most powerful ones. I also alluded to this story briefly in the deep listening excerpt, but there was a young man I met in Kazakhstan who grew up in Afghanistan in a community that didn't have access to potable water. And his family would boil the water that they brought in from the river in order to make it safe enough to drink. And he had a younger brother who he was in charge of watching, and his parents were out. And one day his brother got somehow tangled up nearby the boiling water, and all that boiling water came down on him, and he died from those injuries. And this man Ashan told me how riddled with guilt he felt, again, for that loss. But as he got older, he realized that if he dedicated his life to water engineering and trying to create access to safe drinking water in communities like the one where he grew up, that no one else would have to die from a similarly tragic fate. And yeah, it was a really powerful story to hear, especially because he had never told it with anyone before, but he was so eager to share. And I think that's what a little piece of cardboard can do, right? When we create invitations to share in this way, it can be really powerful. Yeah, thank you.
I just want to recommend another resource that will produce hope.
Yeah.
It's an email once a week called Future Crunch. And it is full of stories like the one you told about the wetlands being, part of it is environmental stuff, and another part is public health, which is also very important. It's produced in Australia, and I heartily recommend it to anyone interested. It will cheer you up, it will give you good news, which is we all need these days. Future Crunch, you can find it online. You do have to pay for a subscription, but I think it's well worth it, and they give a third of it to various groups that are nonprofit groups that are good ones. So Future Crunch.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
One of the takeaways from your conversation is listening. I wrote a recent commentary, and I found out that in trying to defend my position, it was kind of useless. The best way was to listen so that I could then have a conversation. And this particular commentary was about how public preference in the petroleum industry are coming together with the auto industry to change our future, even without a lot of government intervention. So it brought to me a lot of hope about what can happen over the next few years about one of the major pollutions in this world. And so thank you for reminding me to listen.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so glad that you're writing about these issues too. And I think one other thing I learned, there's this really incredible resource out of the Yale program on climate change communications, and they do these longitudinal surveys of the American public and about how attitudes on climate change are changing over time. And it was interesting, even when I started this project back in 2013, 2014, it was so much less a part of our national conversation. And 10 years later, it's hard to go a few days without hearing a climate story, right? But one thing that they found in their research is the importance of values-based communication. And it's exactly what you're getting at. Rather than trying to come at somebody with all the facts and figures and, winning an argument in a kind of, I don't know, powerful way, in that way, people will turn off, right? And so if we can connect with someone over a shared value, it becomes so much easier to bridge those lines of difference.
Thank you, Devi, for a really good talk about what we're facing throughout the world. But I want to share with you that right here in Santa Fe County, we have a place that needs a lot of attention and a lot of environmental justice, and that is the Caja del Rio. And it is a place that is being desecrated by trash. And there was a story in the paper. I have been working on developing a shooting range with BLM because the only way I can get shooting off of the Caja is to create a place for them to go shoot so I can close all the rest of the Caja. And, we have to come up with creative ideas. I was at the first Earth Day. I care about the climate my entire life. But sometimes you have to come up with solutions. I'm the last person who would ever want to support a shooting range. Okay, the very last person. But I want to protect the Caja del Rio, and I want to invite everyone here who's local, because this is our own environmental disaster that is happening. And the tribes, the All Indian Pueblo Council are completely in support of this, and we're all working to make this a monument. So anything Global Santa Fe can do, I'm also the president of the National Heritage Area here, the Northern Rio Grande. We're all working to make that place protected. So I just want to share that with everyone here, because I think we have to also remember our own local stories that we can do here to protect our own county and environment.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's such a important thing. Yeah.
We have some more questions. We have lots of time, so keep thinking about your questions.
Thank you. Almost on that same theme, in your 1001 stories, you're telling us stories of the effects of climate change. Did you hear efforts to mitigate the effect of climate change as opposed to stopping climate change? What are people doing to cope with Tuvalu flooding, for instance?
I mean, I think it's unfortunate, but the main coping mechanism is the Pacific Access Category visa that New Zealand opened up for people from small Pacific Island nations to come and come to higher ground in a completely different country. On the kind of solutions part, one other really interesting and I think powerful story that I'll mention comes from Denmark. It's this community called Samso, which is an island that is known for potato farming. And someone high up in Danish government decided that they were going to use this island as an experiment to see if renewable energy would be possible in Denmark. And again, this was probably 15, 20 years ago now. And it was really, and there's a ton of wind, so wind turbines were the most logical solution. And it was difficult to get those potato farmers on board. They were just suspicious of it, like, why? I don't want to be told what to do, right? But there was one farmer that said yes. And then there was a terrible storm that knocked out power, and the only place that had electricity on the island was the farmer who had gone ahead with the wind turbine. And suddenly everyone was like, oh, this is a great idea, right? I want my lights on too. And so in the intervening couple of decades, Samso has become this renewable energy hotspot, right? And I think because it is an island and there's really well-defined barriers to the community, right? It's been almost easier to measure that adoption, and they send excess energy back to the mainland, and also in the last couple years have been experimenting with the last thing that's in the way of them becoming completely renewable, which is the ferry that goes back and forth to the island, was using fracked gas. And so they're trying to create a biogas digestate system where the remainder of crops or specific crops on the island can be grown, and then they would create biogas from that. And then people are now all up in arms about that because they're concerned about a smell coming from it, right? So it's, many levels of convincing, but speaking of, linking this back to Tanea's story a little bit, I think what's so powerful about her actions is not only what she can do as an individual, but the education function and teaching the next generation of people. And so Samso now has this renewable energy institute on the island that's a building that tells the story of what they've done, but they invite people from all over the world to come and think about how they could apply these same principles of renewable energy to their home communities and learn to think more like the people in Samso do. And there's lots of examples like that, but that's one that I think is a especially powerful model.
And as we're waiting for the mic to come, could you talk a little bit about attending the COP22 in Morocco and the almost inherent tension and friction between the developing countries, the developing countries and emerging nations and developed countries?
Sure. So I had the great privilege of going to the UN Climate Conference in Morocco. These happen every year in different countries around the world, and representatives globally come together to try to create, to negotiate on these issues and create change, which it's hard to say if it's been successful because they've been happening every year that I've been alive, and here we still are discussing these issues. But one thing that I think was especially powerful was looking at, the people who came who are civil society members who don't have any negotiating power but are there because they're so fired up about these issues. They see the impacts in their communities, or they're leaders from indigenous nations that don't have representation in the UN but still want their voices to be heard. And I think that, there's a lot of conversation about, whether countries that have been disproportionately impacted should be compensated, and that countries that are wealthier should be the ones putting money into those funds for loss and damages. And then there's a whole bunch of resistance to doing that. And, I think it's easy to see how stuff gets really knotted and snarled, but I think at their best, those types of international events can become spaces for a change and exchange for folks who are working on these ideas globally, but it's also really easy to be jaded.
Yeah, thanks. So how much of an opportunity did you have to do deep listening with climate deniers? And, I'm reactive just like anyone else, and I just assume it's, ignorance and, selfishness and things like that, but did you discover more?
Yeah, I love this question. So one of my first days traveling in New Zealand, I was not familiar with the country's bank holidays, which are different than here. And so I ended up in a beach town on a bank holiday. I don't even remember what it was, but there was nowhere to stay. Even the campgrounds were full. I'm like, uh-oh, I'm in a pickle. So started looking around me, and I'm like, that couple looks friendly. So I'm like, hello, do you know of anywhere I might be able to stay? And they're like, oh, everything's going to be really full up. And then they look at me and my bike. They're like, you should just come stay with us. I'm like, okay. And their names are Bill and Julie, wonderful humans, turn out to be total climate deniers, like vehement climate deniers. And we find this out as we're having like tea and cookies later in the evening. And they're like, so why are you doing this? I'm like, oh, I'm collecting stories about climate change. And they're like, oh, climate change. It's a bunch of, hogwash. And I thought to myself, I'm like, well, I could get reactive in this moment, or I could bring out my stable of facts. Or I could just sit here and listen. And I'm like, oh, well, why do you think that? Why, right? And it became this really powerful conversation that I still hold with me to this day. And I'm so grateful to them for, inviting me into their home, but also for being so open. And they're like, well, when we turn on the news, it's always the same picture or the same video of the same iceberg calving into the ocean. Or, people will talk about like the same polar bear floating on a piece of ice, right? And it's just, someone has to be profiting from all of this, and they just want to dupe us. And I realized that it was two things that were happening. One, the way that the media was telling the story of climate change was relying on these really cliche images that weren't resonating with these people's everyday lives. And two is that I think, it's a science education and a science communication problem, right? So the folks who were trying to tell the story of climate change to them weren't connecting with Bill and Julie where they were at, but also Bill and Julie's science education had failed them because it hadn't given them the knowledge of the terms that would let them understand what someone on the evening news was trying to say about this problem. So I think that comes full circle about just how important it is to switch up the way that we talk about these issues. Because if we're always using the same kind of story, the same kind of image, the same iceberg, we're not going to connect with the people who we really need to connect with. Yeah.
From that, Debbie, talk about your master's and how that helped you discuss better climate change.
Yeah, so I did this master's program in science writing, which was all about learning how to kind of bridge that gap, exactly that, between an expert in a very esoteric subject who's using the jargon of their discipline that's shorthand, and an everyday person who might not know all those terms. And for me, as a person who loves words, it's a really fun act of translation, being able to try to bridge those two things. And I think we just need more and more of that, not only on climate, but on public health issues, on everything.
Yeah, so we all know about the issues and everything, but you didn't just say anything about what are the causes, and just who are the people doing all these things? Because where I'm from Pakistan, and people are not contributing that much, but they have floods and everything. So my question is that who's responsible for all these things?
Yeah, it's the fossil fuel industry, but also countries like our own, like the U.S. here, China, others who have contributed disproportionately to the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere over the last century or so.
First of all, I just wanted to say thank you so much for sharing all of these stories with us.
Thanks for coming.
But in my life, one of the biggest issues that I've seen with climate change has been feeling disconnected from it. The people around me and even myself experience not just physical disconnection from the reality of climate change, but psychological distance. And I think one of the ways that you talked about this was the difference between people of different ages and the way that they experience climate change and the differences that they've seen in their lives. So I was just wondering if you had any stories that you've heard or advice on how to bridge that gap between people of different ages. That way we can all work together despite our differences to combat climate change.
Yeah. Gosh, that's such a good question. I would almost throw it back to you because I think that you might have some really good ideas too for connecting with folks who are your peers, right? For me, I think it's about changing up the way that we have these conversations. So it's not just abstract and numerical, but it's grounded in what's happening in Caja del Rio. It's grounded in what we're seeing with water supply in New Mexico. It's grounded in something that's really local and tangible that people can feel connected with based on their own life experience. And then beyond that, I think that it's easy to not want to think about these issues because they're really scary. but also easy to feel like if I do think about these issues, then I'm taking the whole weight of the world on my shoulders and that will crush me, right? And so I think it's just so important to not go it alone and to find other like-minded people who are thinking about these issues where you are and then doing something together, because that for me, like getting back to hope as a verb, is about like how we can not get bogged down in that but be doing something concrete, whether that's collecting trash or advocating for legislation that changes something or using whatever it is that your specific gifts and talents are to go after a cause that you care about and make a change. And I think that when we do that together, it's really powerful.
There's a saying that when your ox is gored, or where do you stand depends on where you sit. Your experience and the voices of people sound like this could become a movement. Now, at the last meeting in Egypt, all of the usual cast of characters were there, plus some of these people who do not have a voice came. And instead of really talking about some very technical things, most of the conversation ended up with countries from the Caribbean, the lower islands, from the Stans, and led by Sherry Rahman of Pakistan, who were gathering attention. We produce 1 or 2% of the effects of climate change. It's time that we had reparations and that you really came to us, and you have to change your organizations, change the approach of the World Bank to include public participation, education, as well as technology. USAID also. And EPA in this country used to have a very good public participation component. Why don't you go back to Harvard? Because you have that very influential group there. Yeah. And people like John Kerry are getting unhappy because they haven't been able to get anything done, although he's tried very hard. You need a movement.
Yeah.
And have you thought that you might help lead that movement, because you represent what people are telling you, their ox has been gored?
That's a big ask, but also I think very important. I don't know. I think I kind of like. I love listening, and I don't often like think of myself as someone way out in the front. But also, you know, if the opportunity were to present itself, I would try to do my best. But for right now, I'm like just a humble editor, you know.
Well, I think we'll start a draft Devi movement right now.
Okay, yeah. Thank you all so much. Yeah.
Sean, did you?
Are there any more?
I'll ask her in the car.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay. What I wanted to ask is,
Yes.
it's easy when you're like-minded to be able to hear a lot of these stories. I'm curious how there is a righteousness in the green movement in knowing that everybody else is wrong, right? Yeah. And I guess what I'm trying to say is I love the notion of deep listening. It's really hard to do. I think we all need to learn how. But I'm wondering if you had advice, or if you even experienced it yourself when you're with these groups. I was kind of thinking about when you were at the meetings and you were in the camps and the tents and everyone's singing, and I was thinking there's got to be people on the other side just rolling their eyes, right?
Sure. Yeah.
You know, the U.S. was in the book where you're singing these songs, and I thought, how is it that we can sort of know we're right, if you will, and you want to fight the fight, but also really understanding how to do that in a way that is inclusive?
Yeah. I don't know if I have a one-off answer to that, but I think that a lot of it comes from having the curiosity about trying to understand where someone who has a different perspective from us, and this isn't just on environmental things, but on, choose your poison, right? We could talk about abortion, we could talk about immigration, we could talk about anything, but it's not just understanding what someone's perspective is, but what life experiences have led them to having that point of view. And I think that if we're able to tell a story to each other, it's like one of the most ancient human technologies we have, right? and it's activating the storytelling brain rather than just the facts and figures, numbers brain, right? And so there's a potential to connect around that and to have some more empathy from someone, even if their perspective makes us want to hurl something, right? But trying to get past that instinct can be powerful and sort of bring us down from that righteousness in a way. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah.
Devi, thank you so much for being with us, and I suspect you'll be happy to go outside and sign some copies of books. And we're getting close to the graduation season, so don't just get one for yourself, get one for somebody who's graduating, right?
Great. Yeah, thank you so much for coming. Thank you all. Yeah.
And let me remind all of you, on May 17th, we'll be hosting Mike Hammer. He is in the hot seat right now because he is the United States Special Envoy for the Horn of Africa. So make your reservations because I suspect that program will sell out pretty quickly. And Susan, it is in the evening here, right? On May 17th. So right back here at Hotel Santa Fe. So make your reservations and spread the word about Global Santa Fe. And again, Sean, it's great to have you here. Thank you, everybody.